Himadri, sir. Thank you for joining in. It's a pleasure to host you.
My pleasure also.
Sir, I think, when I wake up every day today and go through the newspapers, there's one word that I keep seeing. It's called fraud. And when I'm even, something I'm typing on the Google, and probably since I'm a part of the ecosystem, when I write the word India, banking, financial ecosystem, any of these words, there's again a story coming out, mule account, fraud, you know, and as a consumer, I feel scared when I wake up and I see this, right? Although, I'm a part of the ecosystem, work with banks, I talk to technology companies. The thought and the idea of this exposure becomes increasingly fearful, and I wonder, how people in India today feel when we look at this. So you have been associated with the banking ecosystem of the country for a long time, and you've been at the helm of it. My first question to you, and to try and understand your perspective, that how do you react, as an individual, as someone who has been in that ecosystem, who has seen it through. When you see this word coming up again, do you see this becoming a new pattern? Do you see this something that was always there and now getting highlighted more? Do you feel scared?
Scared, I'm not sure, but frauds have been there in the banking system. It's not that it's not something very new. But what has happened is the scale. And by scale, I mean the number rather than the value of such frauds. So, as the economy has moved towards increased digitization, small value transactions have kind of just taken off. Whether it's our own UPI, which was launched a few years back, or even before that through the other card modes available. So, to when I joined the banking system to what it is now, there is a huge change. I mean, in my initial days, it was largely paper and document based things, and you are trained or taught to have some intuition in terms of detecting those frauds. But now that has largely become kind of things you don't see. It just goes through, and as a result, clearly there is a huge amount of protection that we require, and where you need to be a step ahead of all these people who are planning these frauds. And in that sense, there is a lot of work which is going on, and I think RBI has played its role to the best of its ability. And if you look at the tech prowess of a country like India, I think we should be in the forefront of developing safeguards, mitigation against these kinds of digital frauds. And at some point, I'm sure that this word that you talked about, being in fear, would slowly go away as we transition to a place where these are more protected in that sense, or at least you are able to detect and prevent.
Perfect. I think that was a very strong and confident response, and I think it gives some bit of assurance to a consumer in terms of how the banking fraternity is looking at it. As you said, right, when you joined in, it was all papers, and now you can't see it anymore, right? Uh, do you think that today we are at the brink of innovation? Things are changing, things are evolving. If I try to understand what is banking going to be 10 years down the line, I don't know. I can't picture it, because the way AI is moving, the way technology is moving, the trends are seemingly increasing in terms of impact, and it's very difficult to imagine. You've seen this for the last 27 years or more. You've seen change after change after change. What do you think have been some of the basic fundamental principles that you feel that we have followed, or you have followed, or people have followed, and they should continue to do in this ever growing change of innovation, to keep things in place, to keep things in sanctity, to not compromise risk for growth?
That's a difficult one. uh, First, I think post 9/11, there was a big realization all around that the financial part of all these which happen around the world is emerging to be the crux. And how you tackle that, a lot of laws, a lot of other things followed. That helped in that sense to at least appreciate that this is an emerging area of threat all across the world, because these are global movements. It's not that one country or one bank can tackle these effectively. So you needed systems which could track as far as possible real time, and then kind of send those triggers or signals or alerts to the people who are supposed to act on those. And if you look at the evaluation as to what are the fundamental principles of kind of making sure that the transaction that is happening is bona fide, I think, as I said earlier, there were lots of rules which were prescribed. And as a banker, when you start off, you kind of first go through those, and then to the best of your ability, you apply those on things which you see on your desk as they move. But what happened in banking or in general across the financial sector is we moved towards instruments where slowly we kind of let go these paper based authentications, and we moved towards more kind of electronic authentications. The initial phase was probably the ATM introduction all across the country. Lots of debit card in India got flooded. So initially, if you see that transition, the frauds used to be some hardware based instruments like card readers or things which you can put on a sort of ATM machine or a POS or something and capture data and kind of break that authentication layer. But now the phase that we are in is largely where it's about software based ways of breaking that authentication and kind of making sure that you move money through all these, you mentioned mule accounts, which are largely conduits for these illicit money. And when you see this part, the innovation which has to come from what we started off saying as big data. And we had models, we had developed these models over the last say 10 odd years, once the data sort of refining started in that sense. But the problem was to actually execute it on a real time basis over so many accounts and so many transactions happening during the day. And as the softwares got better, as the server capacities got better, I think now we are in a position where we can actually detect something at the moment and then do a preventive action. I mean, you can probably send an alert, or even you can freeze a transaction. And I am not talking about just one bank, I am talking about the entire ecosystem through the network of settlement that you actually participate. And that's the way to go. The next step in terms of prevention is where you don't stay individualistic. This has to work on a more broader network basis, where probably the fintechs will play a big role, as I see, where they can create models which will sit on top of the entire network where all these banks or financial institutions participate, and make sure that they are able to prevent these movements. The whole idea in terms of frauds is how you move the money quickly without getting detected. So how do you prevent that is something where you sit across the settlement networks and prevent it at the moment.
You know, I'll pick up a few things that you mentioned, right? I think I love the way you said hardware and then it moved into software and then it's coming into monitoring. and then it's becoming an analytical exercise. Uh, when fintech first came, and the general impression that was there, I don't know how much of it is true, but the general impression was that banks, as custodians of money of people, have very little room to innovate, and for them order and stability is more important than exploration. And I think that was probably what gave the room for fintech to come in and innovate, as service providers to the regulated bodies, and being able to lend that arm of innovation. So as the financial inclusion also started happening, the scale started happening, came chaos, and chaos was invited into the entire order of stability that was established out there. uh, and now again, the expectation is back on technology and fintechs to say, okay, you've gotten this chaos, now you need to bring the house in order. And that's where some of these technologies are coming to say de-risk the growth, right? uh, at the same time, as someone who has been on the other side of the table, and you've looked at the fintech ecosystem grow, and you know in a personal capacity, you have been advising banks, fintechs, multiple of these stakeholders. Where do you think that the room of opportunity is today? What would you say that something that is today still not being still missed, by the fintech ecosystem, or somewhere it's missed by the banking ecosystem? Where do you think the relationship, or do you think it's an area where both have reached their best level of cooperation? Do you think there's a room of opportunity of growth between both the sides to come together for a more sustainable growth out here?
So, I think the fintechs have contributed massively in the last, say, 10 years, more so in the last 5 years, when things, at least in terms of what do I say, the transactions becoming simpler, and in that sense, it has helped the bigger institutions where, as probably you didn't say, but I can say it, is that they are kind of hampered by their legacy systems. In a big large bank or a big financial institutions, it's almost impossible to kind of rewire the entire thing, because you are sitting on massive transactional data, massive legacy data in terms of their constitutions, their KYC documents, and these run in crores. So, it's not very easy for them to quickly be nimble and maneuver, and that's where the fintechs actually helped us, and they continue to help us. But what I would probably take from what you just said is the initial part where the banks kind of partnered with fintechs was more towards this being a marketing and a sales activity, that how can you onboard clients at the lowest or the cheapest cost with the fastest speeds possible. I mean, that was the basic mantra, whether you were onboarding liability clients or selling some products, or you are doing some assets in terms of lending either individually or to corporates. I mean, SMEs, we know that we did. The other part where fintechs played a role, and by the way, the banks stuttered for quite some time, was the financial inclusion bit. I mean, when you talk about a country like India, it's kind of mind-boggling, the corners that you need to reach to actually effectively do that implementation. But banks always struggle, and initially there was this pattern of opening a lot of branches, posting people, but even then they struggled because it was massive. I mean, the recovery mechanism, the other things that you put, they were very costly, and everyone wanted something which was an alternative model, which was easier to execute and less costly in that sense to the larger banks. And that's where again fintechs played a role. Plus there were other enablers which the government created, and that's something that I think we should acknowledge all the time, the way government helped in terms of creating that stack, and then everybody could kind of use those. And a lot of these payment settlements which used to happen through the archaic models shifted to these newer abilities that we could develop. And as I said, it was largely about executing those transactions, onboarding clients, facilitating sales of other items to those clients. But what I see as a future is, as you do that, because that's not going to stop in a country like ours where you see GDP at 7.5 and 8 all the time, there will be this 15-20% Hindu rate of growth in minds of every CEO who is operating in the Indian ecosystem. So they need all the help that they require to get to those targets. But what the fintechs can actually play a role is how to get there without kind of taking undue risks. And when I say undue risk, it's not just the point of sort of doing something wrong, but also taking care of the ignorance factor or lack of awareness factor which prevails in the community. That's a very important thing that we have not touched. We think that by posting some advertisements or sending these once in a while emails, we have done enough. But if you look at the Indian society at large, especially senior citizens or people at the hinterland, they don't know so much. They definitely like the convenience of buying a small sachet of pan masala from a shop and paying it through a QR without taking out the cash. That has probably happened to a large extent. But is there a risk involved? Do they actually appreciate that? The answer is sadly no. And that's not even happening in a large developed city. So what to talk about a country like India? I mean, that's a space which is open space, a white space where a lot of work can be done.
I think two key things that I'll pick from what you said, and thanks for that lovely insight. One is DPI, digital public infrastructure. You talked about the government, and second was financial literacy. Somewhere you indicated in terms of the space for being able to, if I go back to even mutual funds and the way the or any social movement, right, through NGOs, through social sectors, we've always been at the helm of educating. So why not this? I'll touch upon financial literacy. I think a couple of things there, but before that, let me come back to DPI, digital public infrastructure. Although it's a great initiative and has been the foundation stack for the last 5 years of growth, we also see negatives in the sense that we are seeing leakage of databases, etc. Sometimes most of this fraud is happening in collusion with certain database operators, etc. While the government has created the infrastructure for greater good, the unfortunate part is there is misuse of it and misuse by people in terms of being able to leverage it. And the funny part that we see is, if I look at the trend in fraud, right, most of the fraudsters that are behind it are late 20s or mid 20s, right, or early 30s, who are actually leveraging the technology and everything to misuse it. So when you look at digital public infrastructure as a stack, right, and it will just keep on growing probably, right, what would be your thought from both an enterprise and a consumer perspective? How can enterprises be more responsible about how they consume it, and how can consumers be more responsible, or even be protected from what information is out there? Because from an enterprise standpoint, I think the intent to leverage information is always there, and hence the pulling of data, digital public infrastructure. But the second part, as a consumer, there is also the point of safety, right, in terms of that, hey, okay, so much information is out there, there's a replication happening, etc. So what are your thoughts from both an enterprise and as an individual perspective of how we should probably look at the DPI or the digital public infrastructure and how we should work towards it?